Marpa before the storm, the making of a translator. Marpa Lotsawa's life before Milarepa. When Marpa Chokilodra was born, Buddhism in Tibet was neither young nor whole. The great wave that had once carried Indian masters across the plateau had long since broken. What remained was water in many containers, some clear, some cloudy, some cracked. Scriptures survived, but their meanings had thinned through repetition. Translations were inherited rather than tested. Lineages were recited more often than embodied. Ritual flourished. Accuracy did not always follow. Monasteries stood firm against the wind, yet inside them arguments multiplied. Some teachers guarded fragments of teachings like family heirlooms. Others taught what they themselves had only half received. The words of awakening were present, but their weight had grown uncertain. It was an age of devotion and erosion, of lamps kept burning while the oil ran thin. Older monks would speak in lowered voices of a time when the Dharma had teeth, when masters crossed mountains to verify a single syllable, when realization mattered more than reputation. Younger monks memorized without asking where the words had come from, or whether they still pointed anywhere real. Into this atmosphere, Marpa was born, a world where the teachings were loved, but increasingly unreliable. In his childhood, Buddhism was everywhere and nowhere at once. Mantras were painted on walls and whispered in marketplaces, yet few could say why they worked. Ritual calendars grew crowded, while discipline grew optional. Empowerments were sometimes given for grain or favor, their gravity reduced to transaction. There were teachers who wore authority like an inheritance, not a responsibility. They quoted Indian masters they had never met, explained experiences they had never endured, and guarded prestige more fiercely than realization. When challenged, they answered with lineage names instead of clarity. Monasteries multiplied, but training shortened. Students memorized volumes, yet were rarely pressed to transform. Silence was avoided. Hard questions were postponed. Comfort crept in, disguised as compassion. This shaped him early. He grew suspicious of ease. As a boy, Marpa watched monks hurry through rituals, so they could eat while food was still hot. He saw disputes settled by seniority rather than truth. He noticed how quickly anger surfaced when reputation was threatened, how easily humility vanished when offerings arrived. He listened carefully and began to hear the gap between speech and conduct. Once, when Marpa was still a boy, a traveling lama arrived in the valley. Word spread quickly. The man was said to hold a rare empowerment, one that promised protection from illness and bad rebirths. Families cleaned their houses. Offerings were gathered. Even those who usually stayed away came, driven by a quiet fear. The lama sat on a raised cushion, wrapped in fine robes that had clearly traveled less than his reputation. He spoke fluently, confidently, strings of familiar phrases flowing without pause. People nodded, relieved by the sound of certainty. When the empowerment was finished, someone asked a simple question: how the practice should change the way one lived. The lama laughed lightly and waved his hand. Practice is subtle, he said. What matters is devotion. Later that evening, Marpa saw the same lama bargaining angrily over the size of an offering. His voice sharp, his face tight with irritation. The words of compassion had not survived the afternoon. That night, Marpa asked an elder monk whether the empowerment would truly protect people. The monk hesitated. It should, he said finally, if it was done correctly. The pause did more damage than any denial. Marpa understood then what many adults would not admit, that faith was being asked to compensate for uncertainty. that people were being told to trust not because the teachings were alive, but because questioning them had become inconvenient. From that moment, something hardened in him. Not disbelief, but resolve. If the Dharma was to be trusted again, it would have to be earned. He noticed how smoothly people spoke about emptiness while clinging fiercely to comfort. He watched men bow deeply in temples and then bargain cruelly in markets. The split lodged in him like grit under the skin. Marpa did not rebel by rejecting Buddhism. He rebelled by refusing to accept it diluted. Before disciples gathered, before towers rose and fell, before a gaunt yogi knocked at his door, there was a sound Marpa learned to trust, the sound of hoovers striking stone at dawn. In the half-light before morning fully admitted itself, when frost still clung to grass like a second skin, Marpa would stand outside and listen. Hoovers carried truth in them. They announced distance honestly, without philosophy. A horse could not pretend it had traveled farther than it had. Its breath, steaming into the thin Tibetan air, confessed the road. Marpa trusted this more than words. He had learned early that speech bends easily. Prayers can be performed without presence. Gestures can be borrowed. Even devotion can be mimicked. But the body, cold, tired, breathing hard, does not lie. It reveals what the mind would hide. The path, he would later say, does not announce itself with incense or bells. It does not ask permission. It arrives like a mountain wind, sudden, cutting, undeniable, and it strips you of whatever cannot withstand it. Long before he knew the names of Indian masters, long before Sanskrit syllables scorched his tongue, Marpa sensed that his life would not be a gentle accumulation. It would be a narrowing, a burning away, a translation not only of words but of blood and bone. In the early mornings of his youth, he would watch traders depart, small figures swallowed by distance, and feel an ache he could not explain. Not envy, not restlessness, something sharper, as if a debt were being tallied somewhere beyond the horizon, and his name was already written beside it. The road chooses some people, an old traveler once told him, tightening a saddle strap with cracked hands. The rest choose comfort. Marpa did not answer, but the words lodged in him like a seed in frozen ground. Even then, before resolve hardened into action, he understood something essential, that if truth existed, it would demand payment. Not once, but again and again. Not in theory, but in weather, hunger, humiliation, and loss. This book begins before the payment was due. It begins with a man listening to hooves on stone, shaped by a world where the Dharma survived, but needed to be proven again. Chapter 1. The Weight of Words. Marpa learned early on that words could be weapons, or excuses. In his village, speech flowed easily. Blessings were handed out like grain scooped from an open sack. Vows were spoken loudly, then forgotten quietly. When winter pressed down and food grew scarce, compassion learned to limp. When disputes erupted, doctrine was pulled out like a shield and held at an angle that protected only the speaker. Marpa noticed who spoke beautifully and who acted when no one was watching. He was not a pleasant child. His questions landed with weight. He did not ask to understand, he asked to test. Elders found him exhausting. Monks found him disrespectful. He accepted punishment without apology, then returned with the same gaze, sharpened. One afternoon, a monk gathered the children in the prayer hall. Smoke hung low. Butter lamps sputtered. The monk spoke of boundless compassion, of how a bodhisattva would give his own body to relieve suffering. The children listened, wide-eyed. Marpa remembered the traveler. Only days earlier, a man had collapsed near the edge of the village, thin, coughing blood into the dust. He had asked for shelter. The same monk had turned him away, muttering about impurity and bad karma. No one asked where. When the teaching ended, Marpa stood. His voice did not shake. "If compassion has no conditions," he asked, "why did you refuse the man who was dying?" Silence cracked the room. The monk's face tightened. He said the traveler's karma was heavy. He said interference could make things worse. He said wisdom sometimes looks like refusal. Marpa sat down. He had heard enough. That night, his mother struck him for his insolence. His father warned him that monks were not to be challenged. Marpa did not protest. He lay awake, listening to the wind scrape the roof, and understood something cold and precise. Sacred language could be used to abandon people. From then on, he watched more closely. He saw empowerments traded for offerings. He saw initiations rushed so meals would not be delayed. He saw senior monks silence juniors with lineage names instead of answers. He saw fear of bad rebirth used to keep questions buried. Faith, he realized, was being asked to carry what understanding no longer could. This did not make him cynical, it made him exacting. He began seeking out those who practiced without theater. A farmer who kept precepts even when it cost him trade. A nun who ate little and spoke less, whose silence was heavier than sermons. From them he learned that real discipline left marks. Truth, an old woman once told him while splitting firewood, is what remains when you stop explaining yourself. Marpa took this into his body. By adolescence, his reputation hardened. Some called him arrogant. Others said he lacked devotion. A few noticed he worked longer, slept less, and learned faster than anyone they knew. His anger was visible, but it was aimed, not scattered. He was not rebelling against Buddhism. He was rebelling against its erosion. He would not soften truth to preserve harmony. He would not bow to authority that could not bear scrutiny. He would not inherit a dharma that asked the suffering to wait while explanations were polished. The road had not yet appeared. India was still a rumor carried by traders and cracked lips. But the ground beneath Marpa's feet had already begun to tilt. And once ground begins to tilt, standing still becomes impossible. Chapter 2. Fire Beyond the Passes. India did not arrive in Marpa's life as geography. It arrived as pressure. It came in fragments, through traders with cracked lips, through monks who had traveled just far enough to know what they were missing, through texts whose meanings thinned where certainty should have been. Someone would mention a name spoken carefully, as if volume alone could corrupt it. Someone else would fall silent when asked why they had returned. What remained consistent was this: the Dharma was still alive there. Alive meant dangerous. Alive meant it would not flatter you. Alive meant it would cost something real. Marpa stopped pretending he could stay. At first he argued with himself. He told himself that reform could happen here, that patience was also a virtue, that not everyone needed to cross mountains to practice correctly. These arguments were neat. They were reasonable. They were lies. He had already seen what comfort did to the teachings. When he finally spoke of leaving, his family reacted as if he had announced a death. Land meant continuity. Fields meant ancestry. To sell them was to break a line. Marpa sold them anyway. Gold replaced soil in his hands. It felt wrong. Necessary things often do. On the morning he left, no one offered him blessings. His mother stood rigid, her mouth tight with unspoken fear. His father looked at the ground, as if refusing to witness the choice. Marpa bowed once, not deeply, not theatrically, and turned away. There is a moment when departure becomes irreversible. It is not dramatic. It is quiet. It happens when the road behind you stops offering reasons to return. The Himalayas did not care who he was. Snow erased paths without apology. Wind scoured thought down to breath. Hunger stripped him of metaphor. At high passes his vision narrowed until there was only the next step and the sound of his own pulse in his ears. Men died on those routes. Sometimes they slipped, sometimes they lay down and did not rise. Their absence was marked briefly, then covered by weather. Marpa learned to keep moving even when fear turned heavy and viscous, clogging the body. He learned that resolve was not a feeling, it was a behavior. You stepped again because stopping was worse. Bandits tested him. Illness hollowed him. Nights came when he pressed his forehead into frozen ground and wondered, without poetry, whether this was stupidity. Each time the question arose, another followed immediately. If you turn back now, what will you become? That question burned hotter. When he finally descended into warmer air, the world changed abruptly. Color returned, noise multiplied, languages collide. India did not welcome him, and overwhelmed him. Here, the Dharma argued with itself in public. Teachers contradicted one another openly. Students challenged their masters and were not struck for it. Practices were debated, refined, discarded. Nothing was protected by politeness. Marpa felt both exposed and relieved. This was not a place where reputation could survive untested. He studied as if pursued. Sanskrit tore his mouth open before it obeyed. He slept little. He spent his gold carefully, knowing each coin represented a field that would never return to him. More than once, a teacher dismissed him outright. "If you are here for comfort," one said, barely looking at him, "go home. We have nothing for you." Marpa stayed. He began to understand that crossing the mountains had only been the first severing. Ahead lay deeper ones, of pride, of certainty, of the idea that sincerity alone was enough. By the time he heard the name Naropa spoken without explanation, Marpa was already stripped thin, which was the only way he could survive what came next. Chapter 3. Broken Open. India did not teach gently. Marpa had imagined masters as pillars, still, complete, radiating certainty. What he found instead were men and women who dismantled one another in daylight. Debates erupt in courtyards where dust rose with voices. Students questioned teachers without apology. Errors were exposed publicly and corrected without mercy. No one protected Marpa's dignity. He moved from teacher to teacher, carrying recommendations that opened doors and expectations that closed them just as quickly. Some laughed at his accent, mimicking his Tibetan vowels, until others joined in. Some dismissed him after a single question. A few accepted his gold, nodded gravely, and never called him back. Each rejection hollowed him differently. Back in Tibet, Authority wrapped itself in robes and ritual. Here, authority survived only if it endured contact. A teacher who misspoke was corrected by his own students, a practice that failed was abandoned without nostalgia. Marpa learned fast, or he was expelled. Sanskrit dismantled him syllable by syllable. Teachers struck the floor when he hesitated, ordered him to repeat verses until his throat burned and his lips split. When he mistranslated even a particle, he was sent to sit outside until nightfall, reciting aloud to no one. A single careless word, one master said, pressing his finger into the palm of Marpa's hand, can rot a lineage for generations. This was not metaphor. Hunger returned, quieter but more precise. Some days he ate only rice water, some days nothing at all. His body thinned, his patience followed. At night he slept where he could, stone floors, temple porches, once beneath a cart while rain soaked the dust into mud. Illness came with the heat. Fever blurred his vision. Parasites hollowed his strength. More than once he vomited beside the road and still forced himself onward, because stopping meant being left behind. Gold disappeared steadily. Each coin spent felt like a field collapsing back. Temple porches fell. When it was gone, teachers' tolerance shortened. Generosity has limits. There were days he was used openly, for errands, copying texts for hours only to have the work discarded, translating for others without acknowledgement. When he protested once, a senior student laughed. "You are not here to be respected," he said. "You are here to be useful." Marpa clenched his jaw until his teeth ached. His temper flared often. Once, after being publicly ridiculed, he shoved another student. He was struck hard in return and thrown out of the courtyard. No one intervened. The final album. Into the walls. Hands, size, rose, neck. That night, his face swollen, he sat alone and shook, not from fear, but from the effort of not leaving. Something fundamental began to erode, not his resolve, but his image of himself as intact. His anger no longer felt righteous. It felt exposed. There were moments, long, grinding moments, when leaving seemed not cowardly, but sane. He could return to Tibet with fragments polished into authority. No one would know what he had not received. The thought sickened him. One evening, dismissed yet again, Marpa sat outside a monastery wall as dusk thickened the air. Insects droned. His stomach cramped. His mind felt stripped, raw, defenseless. For the first time, he stopped arguing with his circumstances. He did not explain himself. He stayed. It was in this condition, hungry, humiliated, finned of pretense, that he finally heard Naropa's name spoken without ornament, not praised, not explained, not offered, simply spoken as one speaks of fire. "If you go to him," someone said quietly, "do not expect to survive intact." Marpa felt no fear, only recognition. Chapter 4. The Man Who Would Not Console. Naropa did not receive Marpa, not at first. When Marpa arrived at the place he was told Naropa sometimes taught, there was no audience, no cushion prepared, no signal that a meeting would occur. He waited. Heat pressed down. Hours passed. Students came and went without acknowledging him. By nightfall, he slept outside the threshold, head on his pack, guarding what little remained to him. At dawn, Naropa appeared briefly, crossing the courtyard as if Marpa were furniture. Marpa stood and bowed. "Naropa," did not return it. "Why are you here?" Marpa asked, already turning away. Marpa answered carefully. He spoke of Tibet, of broken transmissions, of the need for accuracy, of the danger of words that survived without realization. Marpa stopped walking. "You want consolation," he said. "I do not give it." He told Marpa to leave. Marpa did not argue. He did not plead. He returned the next day. Again, Marpa ignored him. On the third day, Marpa demanded gold. Marpa placed it in his hands. Marpa weighed it once, then dropped it into a bowl without looking. "Not enough," he said. Marpa felt heat rise in his chest, old anger, familiar and ready. He swallowed it. He returned to the market and borrowed what he could, trading future labor for present coin. Marpa accepted it and said nothing. Days passed. Marpa was sent on errands with no instruction. He was told to wait, then told he had waited incorrectly. He was scolded for asking questions and scolded for remaining silent. "If I teach you now," Naropa said once, glancing at him sidelong, "you will translate your own confusion." Humiliation returned, heavier because it was intentional. Naropa's gaze missed nothing. When pride surfaced, it was struck. When despair crept in, it was exposed. "Do not bring me your suffering," Naropa said. "Bring me your obedience." Marpa's body learned before his mind did. He learned to move when told, to stop without explanation, to endure contradiction without self-defense. Each correction felt excessive. Each one landed precisely. One evening, Naropa called him close. Marpa thought this was it. Naropa slapped him hard across the face. "That," Naropa said calmly, "was for the part of you that thinks sincerity is enough." Marpa tasted blood and said nothing. Later, alone, rage tore through him. He wanted to leave, to curse Naropa as cruel, to justify himself with stories of noble intention. The justifications collapsed as soon as he examined them. He stayed. Naropa continued to refuse teaching. Instead, he assigned Marpa menial labor, cleaning latrines, holding water, copying texts that were then destroyed. Once, after days of work, Naropa glanced at the pages and tore them in half. "Attachment," he said, "to effort itself." Marpa's hands shook. Weeks blurred. Sleep thinned. Food remained uncertain. The old question returned. Why endure this? Milarepa answered it without asking. "If I give you the Dharma now," he said, "you will use it to protect yourself. I am not here to protect you." Something gave way, not dramatically, not cleanly. Marpa felt a quiet surrender, not to Naropa, but to the process. The need to be seen dissolved. The need to be justified followed. Naropa noticed. He did not smile. He simply said, "Good, now we can begin." Chapter 5. The Long Withholding. Naropa taught Marpa nothing. This was the teaching. Days turned into weeks, weeks into seasons. The shape of time changed. Hope learned to ration itself. Naropa assigned tasks without explanation and withdrew them without comment. Marpa was sent away just as often as he was summoned, praised for obedience one moment, corrected for attachment the next. "Do not measure progress," Naropa said. "Measurement is hunger, pretending to be wisdom." Marpa cleaned floors until his knees split and scabbed. He carried water until his shoulders burned, and then carried more because stopping invited thought. When he copied texts by lamplight, only to be told the handwriting revealed pride. When he asked how to correct it, Naropa said nothing. Once, Naropa hinted at an imminent transmission. Marpa did not sleep that night. At dawn, Naropa sent him to the market instead. Expectation, Naropa said later, almost kindly, is the loudest form of ego. Marpa swallowed the bitterness whole. It settled like gravel. Visions began to trouble him, colors fracturing behind the eyes, dreams thick with symbols he could not place. He brought none of this to Naropa. "If you show me your experiences," Naropa said once, unprompted, "I will know you are lost in them." Silence became discipline. There were moments when Marpa felt emptied past usefulness, when he wondered whether obedience had replaced intelligence, whether endurance had become evasion. The doubt was sharp because it sounded reasonable. Naropa cut through it immediately. "You want guarantees," he said. "There are none. Not even enlightenment guarantees itself." Marpa learned to stand without reference. The final test came without announcement. Naropa ordered Marpa to build a small shrine outside the compound, stone by stone, precisely aligned. Marpa worked for days, hands raw, attention absolute. When it was finished, Naropa circled it once. "Wrong," he said. He ordered it dismantled. Marpa did not protest. Naropa watched closely. When the last stone was cleared, Naropa spoke quietly. "Now you are listening." That night, for the first time, Naropa taught, not with ceremony, not with warmth. He spoke as if correcting a long-standing error, rather than introducing something new. "Do not look for mind," Naropa said. "If you look, you split it. If you analyze it, you miss it. If you stop it, you distort it." Marpa sat perfectly still. "Mind is not found by effort," Naropa continued. "Effort belongs to confusion. Recognition does not strain." He paused, letting the words settle without explanation. "You think suffering comes from pain," Naropa said. "Pain is ordinary. Suffering comes from insisting that what arises should not arise." Marpa felt something unclench. Naropa leaned forward slightly. "Do not try to get rid of thoughts. Thoughts are not the problem. Believing them is." The courtyard was silent, except for insects. "When anger arises, do not confess it. When desire arises, do not decorate it. When clarity arises, do not worship it." Naropa's voice was level, almost indifferent. "Everything you experience is workable until you interfere." Marpa noticed that Naropa never once used the word enlightenment. "Devotion," Naropa said finally, "is not obedience to me. It is obedience to accuracy. If what I say contradicts your experience, check carefully. If your experience contradicts what is true, abandon your experience." Naropa stopped abruptly. "If I continue," he said, "you will cling." Marpa bowed. He did not feel relieved. He felt aligned. Chapter 6. Pointing without a finger. After the first teaching, Naropa withdrew again. Not completely, never completely, but enough to let misunderstanding grow roots where clarity had briefly touched. Days passed without instruction. When Marpa tried to rehearse the words he had heard, they dulled in his mouth. When he tried to apply them, effort crept back in like a habit returning to the body. Naropa watched this without comment. One morning, without warning, he called Marpa to him and asked a single question. "Show me your mind." Marpa froze. He searched inward, grasped at stillness, tried to arrange clarity the way one arranges a seat for a guest. Naropa struck the ground with his staff. "That," he said, "is performance." Marpa flushed. Shame rose fast. "Do not fabricate," Naropa continued, "and do not refuse. Both are lies." They sat in silence. Long enough for effort to exhaust itself, long enough for frustration to lose its edge. Then Naropa spoke again, quietly. "What remains when you stop trying?" Something in Marpa loosened, not dramatically, not blissfully. The search collapsed. There was only immediacy, sound, sensation, awareness without center. Naropa nodded once. "That," he said, "is not an experience. Do not make it one." The teaching ended there. In the days that followed, Naropa repeated this pattern mercilessly. He pointed, then withdrew. He clarified, then destabilized. Each time Marpa tried to hold what had been shown, it slipped. Each time he tried to abandon it, effort returned. "You want a method," Naropa said. "Methods are for beginners. You want confirmation. Confirmation is poison." Marpa learned to stand without reference again, this time inside the mind itself. Once, after a brief glimpse that felt unmistakably clear, Marpa allowed satisfaction to surface. Naropa saw it immediately. "You are already building a house around it," he said. "I will not live there." He sent Marpa away for weeks. When Marpa returned, thinner, quieter, Naropa asked, "Did you lose anything?" Marpa answered honestly, "Only what wanted to be kept." Naropa did not praise him. He simply said, "Good. Now it can deepen." Chapter 7. At the age of 37, Marpa was 37 years old. By then, his body carried the evidence of years spent crossing borders, geographical and internal. His hair, at a life of time, was more than better. His hands were thickened, scarred, no longer the hands of a youth chasing learning, but of a man who had paid repeatedly for every assumption he brought with him. In Tibet, 37 marked a settling. A man would have land, lineage, reputation. Marpa had none of these. He had Naropa, which was to say he had nothing stable at all. This was when Naropa intensified the pressure. Marpa had learned to rest without fabricating, to recognize without grasping. The danger now was subtle, confidence without reference. Naropa moved to dismantle that. One afternoon, after Marpa had sat for hours in unforced clarity, Naropa laughed suddenly. "You think this will last," he said. The words struck harder than a blow. "If it lasts," Naropa continued, "it is dead. If it changes, you chase it. Either way, you lose." He ordered Marpa to abandon practice entirely for several days. "If what you have seen is real," Naropa said, "it will not need protection." Marpa obeyed. Without formal practice, old habits surged. Irritation, desire, memory, everything returned with noise and weight. Panic followed close behind. When he reported this, Naropa nodded. "Good," he said. "Now you are not lying to yourself." Later, Naropa introduced a deeper cut. He praised Marpa publicly. In front of other students, Naropa spoke of Marpa's endurance, his sharpness, his suitability. The words spread quickly. Respect followed. That night, Naropa summoned him. "Did you enjoy that?" he asked. Marpa hesitated. Naropa's gaze hardened. "That hesitation," he said, "is where corruption begins." He stripped away the praise as quickly as he had given it, dismissing Marpa before others the next day, assigning him menial tasks again, ignoring him for weeks. Marpa understood then that teaching was not only what Naropa said, it was how reality was arranged around him. "The world will test what you carry," Naropa said later. "If you need dignity to function, you will poison the Dharma." At 37, Marpa learned what age could not grant, the ability to be diminished without becoming small. Naropa watched this closely. "Now," he said quietly, "you are almost dangerous enough to teach." Chapter 8. The Weight of Transmission. Naropa did not announce the transmission. He never did. One morning, without preface, he told Marpa to sit. "Do not prepare," Naropa said. "Preparation is memory trying to survive." Marpa sat. Breath moved. Sound passed through. Nothing special occurred. Naropa spoke. Not many words, not arranged. They fell like stones dropped into clear water. No splash, only widening rings. "Mind has no center," he said. "Do not look for one. Do not replace it with a witness." Marpa felt the old reflex stir and dissolve. "Awareness is not produced," Naropa continued. "It is uncovered when interference stops. If you claim it, you cover it again." Time thinned. Teaching and listening were not two events. Naropa's voice cut without force. "When suffering arises, do not ask why. When clarity arises, do not ask how long. Asking is already movement." Something irreversible settled, not as certainty, but as responsibility. Naropa stopped. "That is enough," he said. Marpa bowed, lower than he ever had. His body understood before his thoughts caught up. Naropa watched him closely. "This is not yours," Naropa said. "If you turn it into property, it will rot. If you turn it into compassion, it will burn." The words landed with weight. Later that day, Naropa called him again. "You will return to Tibet," he said, "not to fix it. Not to save it, to transmit accurately." Marpa felt fear, clean and immediate. "They will misunderstand you," Naropa continued. "They will call you cruel. They will doubt your realization. Do not defend yourself." Marpa said nothing. "If a student suffers under you," Naropa said, "check your motivation. If they do not suffer at all, check it again." The courtyard was quiet. "You will be tested by devotion," Naropa added, "yours and theirs." That night, Marpa did not sleep. Not from excitement, not from doubt, from the simple recognition that something had been placed in his hands that could not be set down. At dawn, Naropa dismissed him. No blessing, no farewell. Marpa left with what could not be displayed, only enacted. Chapter 9. The Road Back is Not a Road. Marpa left India without ceremony. There was no procession, no final instruction whispered at the gate. Naropa did not watch him go. The absence itself felt deliberate, as if even farewell could become something to cling to. The road north did not feel like return, it felt like exposure. With every step, what Marpa carried grew heavier, not because it accumulated, but because nothing buffered it anymore. There was no teacher head to absorb error, no structure to correct drift. Accuracy would now have to arise from within conditions that did not care about it. At night, doubts came differently than before. Not, do I have it, but what will I do with it? He crossed rivers swollen with meltwater. He passed villages where monks argued publicly over donations, their voices sharp, their faces careful. He slept beside traders who spoke of the Dharma the way one speaks of luck, something to be acquired, displayed, leveraged. Marpa listened and said nothing. Once a young monk recognized him as a translator trained in India and asked for instruction. The request was sincere, hurried, hungry. Marpa refused. The monk looked confused, then offended. "I have nothing portable," Marpa said quietly. The monk walked away shaking his head. That night, Marpa dreamed of Naropa standing at a distance, saying nothing, only watching as Marpa tried to speak and found his mouth filled with earth. He woke before dawn, heart steady. Crossing the high passes, his body thinned again. Breath shortened, old injuries ached. There were moments when the mind slipped into raw immediacy, snow, wind, pain without commentary. These were not attainments, they were reminders. "Do not turn conditions into do not turn conditions," Marpa's voice echoed, memory stripped of comfort. As Tibet drew closer, the landscape changed. Familiar slopes, familiar prayer flags frayed by weather and neglect. Familiar symbols, carrying unfamiliar weight. Marpa felt no relief, only a tightening. He understood now that return did not mean resuming a life. It meant entering a field where every action would teach, whether he intended it or not. At the border he stopped and turned once, not to look back, but to stand still. "May I not soften what must cut," he said aloud. "May I not harden what must open." No answer came. He crossed anyway. Chapter 10. The Reputation. Tibet did not greet Marpa as a return. It tested him. Word spread unevenly at first, of a translator come back from India, of someone who had studied with Naropa and returned without relics, without charisma, without miracles to display. People expected stories. Marpa offered accuracy. The mismatch unsettled them. He settled briefly among family lands, long enough to be seen, not long enough to belong. Old acquaintances asked for blessings. He declined. Monks asked for debates. He refused those too. "If you want victory," he said once, "argue with yourself." This was not humility. It was refusal. In monasteries, he watched senior monks recite from memory with perfect cadence and empty eyes. He saw rituals repeated because repetition had become safety. Donations recounted before prayers were finished. Marpa spoke rarely, but when he did, it cut. "You chant what you have not checked," he told one assembly. "You guard forms because you have lost recognition." The room cooled. Some laughed, some bristled. Trust thinned. A rumor began to circulate. Marpa was harsh, proud, unteachable. Another followed close behind. He had learned strange methods in India that damaged compassion. Marpa did nothing to correct this. When villagers brought disputes to him, he listened, then sent them away to resolve it themselves. "If I decide for you," he said, "you will outsource your mind." This angered people more than refusal. A young monk once knelt before him and begged for initiation. Marpa asked him 3 questions, about motivation, about fear, about what he would do if nothing happened for years. The monk could not answer the third. Marpa dismissed him. The monk left in tears, telling others Marpa was cruel. Marpa heard this and felt the familiar heat rise. He let it pass without action. "They will misunderstand you," Milarepa had said. The misunderstanding grew into a shape. Marpa's name became a warning and a challenge. Some avoided him entirely. Others sought him out precisely because he did not console. At night, alone, Marpa examined his motivation again and again. Was he withholding to protect the Dharma, or to protect himself? The question never resolved cleanly. He continued anyway. Chapter 11. The Long Delay. Years passed before Milarepa. Not empty years, heavy ones. Marpa aged into his 40s with no lineage to show for it. The urgency that had driven him across mountains cooled into something harder to name. He farmed, he traded, he argued over land boundaries and grain measures. His life took on the shape of ordinary responsibility. And this, more than hardship, tested the transmission. If realization cannot survive success, Milarepa had said, it is decoration. Marpa prospered enough to be watched. People expected generosity. He gave sparingly. They expected softness with age. He did not offer it. Children were warned about him. Monks spoke his name with caution, as if it were a blade left uncovered. Occasionally, someone would stay, not a true student, never that, but a seeker who lingered, hoping endurance would earn teaching. Marpa waited. He asked questions that exposed hunger for certainty, fear of failure, impatience dressed as devotion. When those surfaced, he sent them away. Each dismissal cost him something, not guilt, clarity. At night, he replayed Milarepa's words, not for comfort, but for correction. If you teach to be needed, Milarepa had said, you will be dangerous. Marpa wondered if refusal itself had become a kind of identity. He watched carefully for that corruption too. There were moments, rare, unwanted, when he felt lonely. He noticed it without indulging it. Seasons turned. His body thickened with work, then slowed. His hair went fully gray. He buried people he had known as boys. He watched monasteries rise and fall into the same patterns of display and decay. Once, after a long day in the fields, he felt a sharp, clear recognition arise without invitation, simple, immediate, unclaimed. It did not stay. It did not need to. Good, he said aloud, alone, still functioning. He had almost accepted that no student would come, not as resignation, as completion. That acceptance was what prepared the ground. Final chapter. What remained? Marpa did not soften in his final years, but he simplified. The sharpness that once defined him narrowed into precision. Less was said, less needed to be undone. His body moved more slowly through the fields, but his attention did not thin with age. If anything, it widened, less interested in correction, more interested in accuracy, sustaining itself without supervision. His wife aged beside him. She had never been a student, and that was why the marriage endured. She did not ask him to teach, did not ask him to explain himself, did not mistake silence for absence. She knew the rhythms of his work, the way he woke before light, the way he returned from the fields, carrying nothing extra. They spoke about weather, harvests, neighbors, about loss, about the small failures that come with living among people. She once asked him, late in life, whether the years of severity had been necessary. Marpa considered this carefully. Necessary is the wrong question, he said. It happened because it was not avoided. There were evenings when they sat without speech, watching smoke lift from other homes. Children played at a distance. Dogs slept near the door. The world did not wait for insight to justify itself. Marpa no longer reviewed his past for meaning. Narapa appeared in memory less as a figure and more as a standard, an invisible alignment against which distortion was still measured. "Did you succeed?" his wife asked once, not unkindly. Marpa smiled, faintly. "Nothing failed," he said. "That is enough." In his final illness, there were no decorations. He did not gather people. He did not summarize his life. He corrected no one. When pain came, he did not ask why. When clarity appeared, he did not hold it. The habits trained over decades functioned on their own, like a tool worn smooth by use. His wife held his hand. "Do you need anything?" she asked. Marpa shook his head. He died without instruction, without display. What remained was not a personality, not a story, not even a lineage as people imagine it. What remained was a way of not lying to experience. That was what he had been given. That was what he had carried.